My family told me to stay away from him, not when he was alive, at his funeral. That should have been my first sign that something was wrong. I was sitting in my truck outside the church engine, off hands frozen around the steering wheel, trying to understand why a dead man still scared the people I trusted most. No one could explain it. They never did. They just told me what I was allowed to feel. Disgust, distrust, distance. For more than 15 years, that man's name had been treated like poison in my family. And I had gone along with it because it was easier than asking questions that might tear something open. But funerals have a way of stripping lies down to their bones. Inside the church, I noticed how carefully everyone avoided the coffin. No speeches, no stories, no family. Just silence, thick and deliberate. And then I saw it. The watch. A cheap stainless steel watch on his wrist. Worn, scratched. The same one I bought for my son on the day he started his first job. That was when my wife leaned in and whispered again, telling me to stay away. Not from the coffin, from the truth. Because that watch meant the man we buried had been closer to my son than I ever was. And whatever my family had hidden from me was big enough to survive 15 years of silence. I sat there realizing something terrifying. If I kept listening to them, I would stay a good husband, but I would never again be an honest father. The cold hit me the moment I stepped out of my truck, the kind that slips through wool and settles in the joints. The parking lot outside St. Andrew's Lutheran sat quiet under a low Indiana sky, sedans and pickup beds glazed with frost. I stayed in the driver's seat longer than I needed to, hands resting on the wheel breath fogging the glass. Funerals had become familiar by my early 60s. This one felt heavier before I ever opened the door. The man inside the church was Marcus Doyle, 55 years old. For more than 15 years, his name had been treated like a stain in my family. Something not to touch. Something to step around. I shut the door, the sound sharp in the stillness, and walked toward the entrance, my boots crunching on gravel. Inside, the air smelled of old wood and candle wax. The organ played low and patient. Conversations dipped as I passed. Not rude, just careful. Carol saw me from the second pew and stood. She reached me before I could take another step, fingers closing on my sleeve with a firmness that surprised me. "Stay away from him," she said, her voice barely moving the air. "From who?" I asked. She did not answer. Her eyes flicked toward the front, then back to me. She squeezed once urgent and returned to her seat, as if the moment had not happened. I stood there alone, feeling like I had walked into the middle of a story everyone else already knew. The coffin rested near the altar, dark wood dulled by the light. Closed. No photo. One modest arrangement from the funeral home. I slid into a pew near the back. I did not recognize most faces. A few older men with weathered hands. A woman sitting straight with tired eyes and a jaw set too tight. No one looked like family in the way families usually gather. I opened the program and felt a small prickle of irritation. Scripture. Prayer. Hymn. That was it. No eulogy, no names. Mine was not there. It should not have mattered. Marcus and I had not spoken in years. Still, there had been a time when our lives crossed in ways my family preferred to forget. As the pastor spoke, my attention drifted to the coffin. I do not know why I looked so closely. Habit, maybe, or something else. I noticed Marcus's left wrist where the sleeve pulled back just enough. A stainless steel watch. Old, scuffed, plain. My chest tightened. I had bought that watch at a department store in Fort Wayne nearly 20 years ago. Ethan stood beside me, fresh haircut, hands shoved in his pockets, trying not to look nervous. His first real job. Warehouse operations at a regional supplier. Nothing glamorous. He was proud anyway. I remember the clerk fitting the band while I told Ethan it would hold up if he took care of it. He smiled then the way he did when he wanted me to believe he was ready. I leaned forward without thinking, as if distance could change what I saw. The scratch near the clasp, the faint discoloration on the band. I knew it too well. Someone sat down beside me. I had not heard him approach. Late 50s, broad-shouldered hair, cut short and going gray. He kept his eyes forward. "You should not be here," he said quietly. I turned to him. "If you have something to say, you can say it." He nodded as if he respected that. I noticed then that he had stood alone through most of the service, arms folded, never once looking at his phone. "Your family warned you when you came in," he said. I saw it. "They did," I said. "Marcus did not have much family left," he went on. "Most of us are here because we owed him something, or because we regret something." I was about to tell him to mind his business when the organ swelled and people began to stand. Coats shifted. Wood creaked. The man leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Your son owed him more than you know." He stood and moved into the aisle before I could respond, disappearing into the slow line toward the doors. I stayed seated, my pulse louder than the music. My son. Ethan was 40 now, married, a father himself. Whatever Marcus had been to him belonged to the past, or so I had believed. Outside, the pallbearers waited. Carol returned to me as the coffin was lifted. "Did he talk to you?" she asked. "Who?" She hesitated. That was answer enough. Briefly, I said. Her mouth tightened. "I told you to keep your distance. You still have not told me why." She looked toward the coffin as it passed the watch, hidden now. "Some things are better left buried," she said. I watched the doors close behind the casket. The room seemed to exhale. I did not. Standing there, I felt the weight of a choice I had made years ago without realizing it. I had accepted a version of the past that cost me nothing to hold. I had not asked the questions that might have unsettled my life. I left the church with the others, the cold waiting for me outside. The sky had not changed, but something in me had. I understood then that whatever my family wanted buried had not stayed with Marcus Doyle. And the fault was not only theirs. I drove home with the radio off the road, unspooling ahead of me through bare trees and frozen fields. Carol rode beside me in silence, her hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the windshield. We did not talk about the man at the church or the watch or the stranger's words. We talked about groceries, about whether the furnace had been making noise again. Ordinary things. That was our way. If we pretended long enough, problems sometimes went away. That night, sleep did not come easy. I lay awake listening to the house settle, my mind circling back to the same question. Why Marcus? Why my son? By morning, the question had sharpened into something harder to ignore. Growing up, I had been taught that you judge a man by his work and his word. Somewhere along the way, I had let my family do that judging for me. When Marcus Doyle's name came up, it was always the same story. He was unreliable. He had been in trouble with the law. He was the kind of man who dragged others down with him. It was said with such certainty that I never thought to ask where it came from. I poured coffee and stood at the kitchen window watching my breath fog the glass. Ethan's accident came back to me then clearer than it had in years. It was 2010. He was 22. A long shift at a distribution warehouse outside Fort Wayne. A forklift. A misjudged turn. The phone call had come late in the afternoon. Not panic, just urgency. At the hospital, the waiting room smelled of disinfectant and burnt coffee. Ethan sat on the bed with his arm wrapped and his jaw set tight. He looked embarrassed more than hurt. I remember thinking that was a good sign. It meant he would be fine. Marcus was there too. I had noticed him right away, standing off to the side, hands clasped behind his back. He did not look like trouble. He looked tired. When Ethan saw him, his shoulders dropped just a little, like he was relieved someone else had shown up. Marcus stepped forward and told me he was a supervisor on site. He spoke plainly without excuses. He said what had happened. He said someone had been seriously injured. He said there would be questions. I remember waiting for the part where he shifted blame or covered his tracks. It never came. Instead, he asked if Ethan wanted him to stay until a lawyer arrived. A lawyer, I said. Why would we need that? Because this is going to get complicated, he said, and because your son should hear his options from someone who does not answer to the company. At the time that line slid past me, I was focused on my son, on getting him home, on making sure he was not in worse trouble than I could handle. When our family lawyer arrived later that evening, Marcus stepped back without argument. He shook my hand before he left and told Ethan to call him if he needed anything. I did not think about him again. Or at least I told myself I did not. Standing in my kitchen years later, I wondered how much of that memory I had edited to fit the story I was given afterward, after the settlement, after the quiet meetings and signed papers, after Marcus became a name we did not say. I went down to the basement and pulled out an old box labeled Ethan. Inside were report cards, a high school letter jacket, a stack of paperwork from his first job. I had kept more than I realized. At the bottom was a folded document I did not remember saving. A business card slipped inside a legal pad, a different law firm than the one our family had always used. The name on the card stopped me cold. It was Marcus's attorney. I sat on the steps and held the card between my fingers. The edges were worn like it had been carried for a while before being tucked away. That did not fit the version of Marcus I had been told. If he was reckless and self-serving, why steer my son toward independent counsel? Why not push him to sign whatever the company put in front of him and move on? Later that afternoon, I called Ethan. I told him I had been thinking about the accident. There was a pause on the line. Not long, just long enough. What brought that up, he asked. I said I had been at a funeral. Another pause. Longer this time. We talked around it, careful not to say names. He told me work was busy, that the kids were doing fine. I asked him if he remembered Marcus Doyle. Silence stretched between us. I could hear him breathing. Yeah, he said finally. I remember him. What did you think of him? I asked. I expected deflection. What I got was something closer to relief. He was the only one who told me I should tell the truth, Ethan said. He said it without drama, like stating a fact he had carried for years. He said it would cost me. He said it was still the right thing. I closed my eyes. Why did you not tell me that? Because Mom asked me not to, he said. Because everyone said it would ruin things. We did not say much after that. We did not need to. When we hung up, I stayed seated at the table long after the coffee had gone cold. That night, I understood something I had not wanted to see. My family had not simply warned me away from Marcus. They had taught me to hate him. They had given me a story that required no questions and asked me to accept it for the sake of peace. And I had. For years. The man I had avoided was the one who told my son to stand up. The man we buried was the one who refused to play along. I sat there in the quiet house, the weight of that realization settling in. Whatever came next would not stay contained in the past. And I knew with a certainty that did not fade that the accident had not been the end of it. It had only been the beginning. It stayed with me through the next few days, the way Ethan's voice had sounded on the phone. Not defensive, not angry, just tired. Like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had finally set it down, even if only for a moment. I kept replaying it in my head while I went through my routines, work errands, small talk with Carol, that carefully avoided anything real. On Thursday afternoon, I drove out to see Ethan. He lived about an hour away now in a newer development, outside a mid-size Indiana town, the kind with wide streets and young trees still trying to take root. When I pulled into his driveway, his truck was already there. I sat for a moment, before getting out, watching the garage door, steadying myself. I had gone over this conversation in my head a dozen times. None of the versions felt right. He opened the door before I knocked. He looked older than I remembered. Not in a dramatic way, just around the eyes. We shook hands out of habit, then he stepped aside and let me in. We sat at the kitchen table. His wife took the kids upstairs, giving us space without saying a word. I noticed the way Ethan waited until they were gone before speaking, like he had learned exactly when it was safe to talk. "You talked to Mom," he said. "Not yet," I said. "I wanted to hear it from you." He nodded slowly. I could see him weighing how much to say, how much to leave buried. That hesitation told me more than any confession could have. Back then, he said I knew what I had done. He kept his eyes on the table, tracing a groove in the wood with his thumb. He told me about the warehouse, about the pressure to move faster, about the moment everything went wrong. A forklift, a blind corner, a man who had worked there longer than Ethan had been alive. He was hurt bad, Ethan said. Everyone knew it. I asked him why I had never heard the full story. He let out a short breath. Because it did not fit the story they needed, he said. He told me how the company lawyers had shown up before the injured man's family even knew what was happening. How meetings were held behind closed doors. How paperwork appeared with reassuring language and heavy consequences. It was all very professional, very calm, very efficient. I wanted to go to the police, Ethan said. I asked Marcus what I should do. I leaned forward. What did he tell you? He said I should be ready to lose everything, Ethan said. He said that was what accountability looked like sometimes. That was when the room seemed to tilt. Marcus had not promised him protection. He had promised him honesty. That did not match the picture I had been given. Ethan told me Marcus had pushed back hard against the company's approach. He had said the settlement was designed to protect the business, not the injured man. He had said Ethan's silence would buy comfort at the cost of someone else's future. When Marcus refused to back down, he was slowly cut out. Meetings stopped. His credibility was questioned. Whispers started. Then Mom stepped in, Ethan said. I felt my chest tighten at that. He went on explaining how Carol and the family lawyer framed it as a necessary compromise. They talked about my reputation, about Ethan's career, about grandchildren I did not yet have. They told me it would ruin you, he said. They told me you had worked too hard for me to throw it away. I sat back, the weight of that settling in. I had always believed I was the shield. I had never considered that I might have been the excuse. The settlement came quickly after that. A civil agreement. Confidential. The injured man received compensation that sounded generous on paper, but could never replace what he had lost. Ethan kept his job. The company moved on. Marcus did not. They said he was unstable, Ethan said. They said he had a grudge. Did you believe them? I asked. He looked up then. Not right away, he said. But after a while it was easier to. I asked him about the watch. He hesitated, then nodded. Marcus gave it back to me one night, he said. He said I would need something to remember what it felt like before all of this. I did not understand what he meant at the time. We sat there in silence, the refrigerator humming softly behind us. I thought about the years that followed, about how Marcus's name faded from conversation, about how the story hardened into something simple and convenient. I thought about my own role, how I had accepted that version without challenge because it allowed life to stay orderly. I told Ethan I was sorry. It felt inadequate the moment it left my mouth, but it was all I had. He nodded, eyes still on the table. I do not know what I expected from you back then, he said. I just know I did not feel like I could ask. When I left his house, the sun was already dropping low. I drove without a destination for a while, letting the road decide. What I had learned did not bring relief. It brought clarity. My son had not been protected from the truth. He had been protected from the consequences. And in doing so, he had been taught the wrong lesson. By the time I turned back toward home, one thing was clear. The accident had never really ended. It had simply been sealed away, along with a man who refused to let it disappear. And the choices made in those quiet rooms were still shaping all of us, whether we admitted it or not. The house felt different when I got back that evening. Not quieter, just tighter, like the walls had moved a few inches closer together while I was gone. Carol was in the living room, the television on, but muted a lamp, throwing a soft circle of light that did nothing to warm the space. She looked up when I came in, and then looked away again, already bracing herself. We had been married for nearly 40 years, long enough to recognize the moments that mattered. This was one of them. I set my keys on the counter and stayed standing. I did not take off my coat. I went to see Ethan, I said. She nodded slowly. I figured you would. We stood there for a moment, both of us choosing our footing. Outside, a car passed, tires hissing on cold pavement. He told me everything I said. About the accident. About Marcus. Her shoulders dropped just a little. Not in relief, in resignation. I was hoping he would not, she said. Not because it was not true. Because once you hear it, you cannot go back. I asked her why she had never told me. The question came out steadier than I felt. She turned toward me then, really looked at me. There was no anger in her face, no defensiveness, just something tired and firm. Because telling you would not have changed what needed to be done, she said. And because I knew you would want to fix it. You always do. I felt heat rise in my chest. Fix it by doing what? By tearing our lives apart, she said. By dragging our son through the mud for something that could not be undone. She stood and crossed the room, straightening a stack of magazines that did not need straightening. I watched her hand move precise and controlled. Marcus wanted Ethan to confess, she went on. To risk prison. To risk everything. That might sound noble to you now, but back then it sounded reckless. We had a choice. A choice for who I asked. For our family, she said. For the life we built. She finally said it then, the thing that had been circling us since the funeral. She talked about the house, the neighborhood, the way people looked at us, about how quickly those things could disappear. She talked about stability as if it were something fragile that needed constant protection. I asked her when she decided Marcus was the enemy. She did not answer right away. The first time he refused to back down, she said, when he would not support the settlement, when he started talking about ethics and responsibility like those words paid mortgages. She met my eyes. He was a liability, and liabilities get cut loose. The word landed hard. Liability. It sounded like something from a boardroom, not a marriage. So you told everyone he was dangerous, I said. I told them the truth as I saw it, she said. That he threatened what we had. That he did not care who he hurt as long as he could stand on principle. I laughed once, short and sharp. You turned him into a villain so we could sleep at night. She did not deny it. I realized then how carefully the story had been managed, how Marcus had been erased not all at once but in pieces, invitations that stopped coming, calls that went unanswered, his name spoken with a shake of the head until no one questioned it anymore. And I let it happen, I said. Yes, she said. You did. That hurt more than anything else she could have said, because it was true. I had trusted her, trusted the lawyer, trusted that silence meant things were handled. I had not asked the questions that might have made me uncomfortable. I asked her if she ever thought about the man who was hurt. She looked away. Of course I did. But thinking about him did not put food on our table. It did not protect our son. I thought of Ethan at the kitchen table tracing the grain of the wood, carrying a weight he had been told was necessary. I thought of Marcus standing alone in the hospital hallway, choosing honesty over convenience. You made a decision for all of us, I said, without asking. She shook her head. Someone had to. The room felt smaller now. I could hear the clock ticking on the wall, each second loud and deliberate. I asked her why she warned me at the funeral. Because I was afraid, she said. Afraid you would start pulling at threads. Afraid you would not stop. There it was. The truth beneath everything else. Not fear of Marcus. Fear of me seeing clearly. I told her I did not recognize the woman she was describing. She told me she did not recognize the man I was becoming. We stood there, two people who had shared a life now divided by the past. We thought we had settled. That night I slept on the couch. Not out of anger, out of necessity. I needed space to think without the weight of her certainty pressing down on me. As the house settled into silence, one thought kept returning. We had always told ourselves we did what was best for our family. But families are not supposed to function like corporations. They are not supposed to write people off when they become inconvenient. Lying there in the dark, I understood something I had not allowed myself to see before. The betrayal I felt was not sudden. It had been built quietly, decision by decision, justified by comfort and fear. And now that it was exposed, there was no way to fold it back into something manageable. Whatever came next would not stay inside these walls. And for the first time, I knew Carol understood that too. The next morning, Carol moved through the house like nothing had happened. Coffee brewed, laundry started. A grocery list sat on the counter in her neat handwriting. It was the same kind of normal she used to wrap around hard moments like plastic over broken glass. I could not do it. Not anymore. I waited until she left for her volunteer shift at the library. Then I went to my home office and pulled open the file cabinet I had not touched in years. Taxes, insurance, medical records, old mortgage paperwork. In the back behind a folder labeled college, I found what I was looking for without realizing I was looking for it. A thick manila envelope, the kind law firms send when they want you to feel how serious something is. It had our last name typed in block letters and a date from late 2010. I sat down and slid my finger under the flap. Inside were documents that smelled faintly of dust and toner, a settlement agreement, a confidentiality clause that ran for pages. Language about no admission of wrongdoing. Language about non-disparagement. A signature line with Ethan's name. My name was not on it. Carol's was not either. Yet somehow I had lived as if I had approved it. I read the pages slowly, then again, trying to understand how something this large had happened in our lives without my full attention. The injured worker's name appeared only once in the entire packet, buried in a paragraph that treated him like a number. A claim, a risk, a problem to be resolved. A second envelope was clipped to the back. A letter from Bennett and Rowe attorneys at law, the firm our family had used for years. The tone was calm, polite, final. It thanked us for our cooperation and reminded us of our obligations under the agreement. It ended with a sentence that made my throat tighten. If any third party seeks information related to this matter, please contact our office immediately and refrain from independent communication. Independent communication. They were not just closing a case, they were fencing off a story. I took the folder and drove into town. The county courthouse sat on the square like it always had a limestone building that looked permanent, even when everything inside it changed. I parked, walked up the steps, and asked the clerk about accessing records connected to a civil settlement from 2010. She gave me the look clerks give when they can tell you are about to learn something you will not like. If it settled out of court with a confidentiality agreement, there may not be much filed here, she said. And if there was a motion to seal anything, you would need a court order to access it. She slid a small form across the counter. I filled it out anyway. Habit, hope, pride. I do not know which. While she checked the computer, I watched people move through the hallway. A man in a suit carrying a briefcase. A woman holding a stack of papers against her chest like armor. A deputy with a hand on his belt. The system in motion. The system Carol believed in. The system I had believed in too. The clerk returned and shook her head. Minimal docket entry, she said. Most of it is not available. Not available. It was a clean phrase for something dirty. I left the courthouse and sat in my truck staring at the steering wheel. I could have turned the key and gone home. I could have told myself I tried. That would have been the old me. Instead, I pulled out my phone and searched for a name I remembered from that night at the hospital. Marcus's attorney. It took a few tries. Firms merge. Partners retire. Numbers change. Eventually, I found an address for a small practice in a neighboring county. I drove there on a hunch that felt like a gamble. The office was in a strip mall beside a barber shop, and a tax preparer the kind of place that survives on steady work and modest expectations. A brass plaque by the door read, Holloway Legal Services. Inside, the air smelled like stale coffee and old carpet. A receptionist asked my name, then went to the back. A few minutes later, a man stepped out. Late 60s, thin, wire-frame glasses. He looked at me with recognition that took a moment to settle. "You are Ethan's father," he said. I nodded. My voice came out rougher than I expected. I was at Marcus Doyle's funeral. His expression did not change much, but his eyes softened as if he had been holding something back for years. "Come in," he said. His office was small and crowded with paper. A framed diploma on the wall. A family photo turned slightly away from the light. He gestured for me to sit, then lowered himself into his chair with the careful movement of a man who has spent decades absorbing other people's trouble. I told him I wanted to understand what happened in 2010. I did not ask him to break any laws. I asked him what could be said, what could be remembered. He was quiet for a long moment, fingers steepled, eyes on the desk. "People think the law is a clean thing," he said. "It is not. It is a tool, and the people with the better grip on it usually win." I asked him about the settlement. He nodded. "The agreement protected the company," he said. "It protected your son from criminal exposure. It did not protect the man who got hurt. It did not protect the truth." I asked him about Marcus. A slight exhale like he had been waiting for that question. Marcus tried to stop it from becoming what it became, he said. He tried to slow everyone down. He said your son should speak to someone independent before signing anything. That is why I was called. I told him Carol said Marcus was a liability. Holloway's mouth tightened. He was. To people who wanted a controlled narrative, he said. Then he said something I had not expected. There was another document separate from the settlement. A statement the company wanted signed. It was designed to make Marcus look like the unreliable one if anything ever surfaced later. They wanted him to sign that he had been under the influence on the job, Holloway said. That he had a history of misconduct. That his account of events could not be trusted. It was a bargain. Sign it, and they would help him clear a charge he had been carrying from years earlier, a minor thing that had become leverage in the wrong hands. I felt my stomach drop, and he refused. He refused, Holloway said. He said he would rather keep his record than sign a lie. I sat back, my hands gripping the arms of the chair. That was the missing piece. The reason the story about Marcus had been so effective. They did not just dislike him. They had destroyed his credibility on purpose, then used that destruction as proof he deserved it. Holloway watched me carefully. You should know, he said, your son was not the villain in that room. He was young. He was scared. He was being coached by people who knew exactly which buttons to press. Family pride. Future. Reputation. That is how they do it. They make survival feel like virtue. I thought of Carol in the living room calling Marcus a liability, with the calm of someone balancing accounts. I thought of Ethan at his kitchen table tracing the grain of the wood, explaining how it became easier to believe what everyone needed him to believe. When I stood to leave, Holloway reached into a drawer and pulled out a thin folder. He did not hand it to me. He held it like a weight. I cannot give you what is inside, he said. Not legally, but I can tell you this. Marcus kept records, notes, dates, names. He believed one day someone would care enough to look. My throat tightened. Where are they now? Holloway's eyes went to the window, then back to me. If Marcus was buried with them, he said, then someone made sure they stayed buried. I walked out of that office feeling colder than when I had gone in. The system had not failed by accident. It had done exactly what it was designed to do when the right people pulled the levers. On the drive home, I kept seeing Marcus's wrist, the scuffed watch on his arm, a quiet reminder pressed against the skin of a man who refused to sign away the truth. By the time I turned onto my street, I understood something with frightening clarity. If Marcus had kept records and they were gone, then the story was not finished. It had been managed, curated, and someone in my life had helped do it. I parked in the driveway and sat there, with the engine off, thinking about who would have access to Marcus's belongings after his death, and why my family had wanted me to stay away from him even then. I sat there long enough that the inside of the truck went cold, the windows fogging at the edges, the silence pressing in until I could hear my own heartbeat. The question I had been chasing all day shifted into something harder. Not who took Marcus's papers, not who controlled the story, but why I had been so willing to let it be controlled in the first place. When I finally walked into the house, Carol was at the sink rinsing dishes that looked already clean. The light above the stove made everything feel too bright. She did not turn around. "You were gone a while," she said. I heard the calm in her voice, the practiced normal, the same tone she used when she did not want the truth to enter the room. "I went to see someone," I said. I could feel her shoulders tighten. She kept her hands in the water. "Who?" she asked. "A lawyer," I said. "The one Marcus used back then." That made her turn. Her face did not change much, but I saw the flicker behind her eyes, the quick math of consequences. "Why would you do that?" she said. I did not answer right away. I took off my coat slowly and hung it by the door like I was trying to keep my hands busy. If I stopped moving, I was afraid the anger would rise too fast. Because I needed to know, I said. Because I should have known a long time ago. Carol set the dish towel down with deliberate care. She looked at me as if I were a stranger who had wandered into the wrong house. "You are digging up things that were put to rest," she said. "For a reason." "Put to rest," I repeated. "Like Marcus." Her jaw tightened. "Do not do that." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, because it was exactly what I had done for years. I had not asked. I had not pressed. I had treated hard truths like they were rude guests you could keep on the porch if you never opened the door. I went upstairs and shut myself in the small office at the end of the hall. It used to be a guest room when the kids were young. Now it was where I paid bills and answered work emails and pretended I had control of things. I opened the desk drawer and pulled out my old phone, the one I kept after upgrading, stored like a backup plan I never used. I turned it on and waited for it to wake up, the screen lighting the room with a pale glow. I did not know what I was looking for. I only knew I had avoided looking for too long. Back in 2010, after the accident, there were phone calls. There had to be. I remembered my own voice on the line with the family lawyer. I remembered the way Carol took the phone from my hand once and walked into the hallway to speak privately. I remembered telling myself she was just protecting me from stress. The phone loaded slowly. Old messages appeared, half of them lost. But the call log was there, dates and times, like a trail of footprints I had never followed. There were numbers I did not recognize. Repeated. Short calls. Missed calls. One in particular showed up again and again for a few weeks after the accident. I stared at it until my eyes stung. I copied the number into my current phone and searched it. Nothing useful came up. Then I tried another way, one of those reverse lookup sites that never gives you much unless you pay. I paid. I told myself it was for clarity. The truth was I could not stop. A name came back. Marcus Doyle. My throat tightened. It felt like the floor moved under me. I sat back and let the guilt land where it belonged. Not in the past. In me. Marcus had called me. More than once, and I had not answered. I tried to remember what I told myself then. Probably that it was not my business. That it was between Ethan and the lawyers. That the professionals were handling it. That Marcus was trouble. That I did not have time. That I was tired. That I did not want to fight with my wife. All of it was true in the way excuses are true. They describe the surface. They avoid the center. The center was simpler. I had been afraid of what I would find out if I listened. Afraid that my son had done something unforgivable. Afraid that my life, the quiet life I built with overtime and careful choices, could be undone by a single honest conversation. And I had been relieved when the calls stopped. I sat there in the dim light of the office and felt something I had not let myself feel in years. Shame. Not the kind you can brush off with a joke. The kind that sits in your chest and makes you breathe shallow. I thought about Marcus standing in that hospital hallway, speaking plainly, saying there would be questions. I thought about Ethan Young, and scared, looking at me like he wanted me to tell him what kind of man he should be. And I thought about how I had outsourced that moment. I had let the lawyer talk. I had let my wife steer. I had let the system decide. Because it was easier than looking my son in the eye and saying we are going to do the right thing, even if it costs us. I heard a soft knock at the door. Carol stepped in without waiting, holding a folded towel like a shield. "Are you done?" she asked. I looked at her, really looked. The woman who had raised our children, who had packed their lunches, who had sat beside me at graduations and funerals and hospital beds. I did not doubt her love. I doubted her definition of it. "Marcus called me," I said. Her eyes narrowed. "What?" "He called me. After the accident." I did not answer. Carol's mouth opened slightly, then closed. For a moment she looked less controlled, as if she had not expected that particular truth. "You did not need to," she said. "That is why we had counsel." "No," I said. "That is why you had counsel, so you would not have to hear him." Her face tightened again. "You do not know what you are saying." I stood up slow and steady. "I know exactly what I am saying. I let you make me into a man who does not answer the phone when someone is trying to tell him his son is headed toward a cliff." Carol stared at me. The towel twisted in her hands. "You are blaming me for you not picking up a phone," she said. I shook my head. "I am blaming myself. I am just finally saying it out loud." The room fell quiet. She looked like she wanted to argue, but something in my face must have told her it would not work. She turned and walked out, leaving the door half open behind her. I stayed there a while longer, listening to the house breathe. Then I did something I had not done in years. I opened a new document on my computer and began to write down everything I knew. Dates, names, places, what Ethan told me, what the lawyer told me, what I remembered and what I did not. Not a confession, not a speech, a record. Because if Marcus had kept records and someone made sure they stayed buried, then the next question was obvious. Who benefited most from them being gone? When I finished, I saved the file under a plain name: Household Receipts. I printed one copy and put it in an envelope. Then I sat with my phone in my hand, thumb hovering over Ethan's number, knowing the next call I made would change things. Before I pressed it, a new notification buzzed on the screen. An email from an address I did not recognize. No subject line. Just a single sentence in the body. "You are looking in the right place. Do not trust your own house." I read the sentence again and again until it stopped looking like English. The glow of my phone lit my thumb as if it belonged to someone else. An email with no subject line. An address I did not recognize. And that warning blunt and intimate, like it came from someone who had watched me for a while. I did not show it to Carol. Not then. I closed the office door, sat at the desk, and forwarded the message to myself, then printed it and slipped it into the same envelope as my notes. My hands were steady, but my stomach was not. The idea that someone knew what I was doing and wanted me to keep doing it made the house feel less like shelter and more like a stage. I called Ethan anyway. He answered on the second ring, voice cautious. "Dad." I told him about the attorney, about the documents, about Marcus refusing to sign a lie. Ethan went quiet, then asked the question I knew was coming. "What are you going to do?" I looked at the page on my desk, the dates and names, the way the past had finally become organized instead of foggy. I felt the old instinct to protect him rise up. The same instinct that had made me ignore phone calls, the same instinct that made silence feel like love. "I am going to tell the truth," I said. He let out a long breath. "You know what that does to us." "I know," I said, "and I should have known before." There was no yelling, no dramatic goodbye. Just the sound of a man trying to figure out if his father was about to save him or expose him. We ended the call politely, like we were discussing lawn care, not a wound that had been festering for 15 years. That afternoon, I drove to the county prosecutor's office. Not the courthouse front desk, not the clerk window, but the building where people go when they have something that might still matter, even when the clock says it should not. A receptionist took my name and handed me a form. I wrote down the incident as best I could. Year, location, employer who was injured, who represented us, what I believed had been hidden. I attached copies of what I had. The settlement letter, the confidentiality language, my written timeline. The name of the attorney who told me about the false statement they wanted Marcus to sign. When I turned it in, the assistant district attorney who met with me was younger than my son. Clean suit, tired eyes. He listened without interrupting, then leaned back and rubbed his forehead. "Mr. Carter," he said, "I am not going to insult you. Most of what you are describing is likely outside the criminal statute of limitations. If there was a felony tied to falsified evidence, it would depend on what we can prove and when it was discovered. That is a narrow path. So nothing happens," I asked. "Something can happen," he said. "Just not the kind people imagine. We can make referrals. We can document. If there are ongoing safety violations at that company, or a pattern, we can notify the right agencies. If attorneys engaged in misconduct, the state bar handles that. If there is new evidence, we can evaluate it. But I need you to understand, this is not a movie." The bluntness hit me like cold air. I nodded. I had not come there for a spectacle. I had come there because the truth deserved a file, a stamp, a place in the world that did not depend on family memory. Before I left, he asked a question that landed deep. Why now? I thought of Marcus in that church, his watch, the way my wife warned me like I was a child about to touch a hot stove. "Because a man died with my son's burden on his wrist," I said. "And I am done letting that be the end of it." I drove from there to the State Bar's Disciplinary Commission office. They did not take walk-ins like the prosecutor did. They took packets, complaints, documentation. I filled out the form and attached the same materials. I kept my language careful. I did not accuse anyone of crimes I could not prove. I described what I knew. I described what I had been told. I included the name of Bennett and Rowe and the specific conduct that made my skin crawl. Pressure to silence, pressure to control witnesses, pressure to bury. 2 weeks passed, then 3. Life kept moving in that strange way it does after you make a decision you cannot undo. Carol spoke to me when necessary and not much else. She slept in our bed, I slept on the couch. The house became a hallway we crossed in opposite directions. Ethan stopped calling. I received letters in the mail with the kind of language that looks polite but feels like a threat. A law firm I recognized by the letterhead asked me to refrain from making defamatory statements. They claimed I was harassing the memory of a deceased man. They claimed I was causing emotional distress to people who had already suffered. I read the letter twice, then put it in the growing stack on my desk. That was when I knew I had hit something real. The system does not warn you unless you are close enough to matter. A month after my first complaint, I got a call from a number I did not know. It was the prosecutor's office. They wanted to meet again. They had pulled an old incident report tied to that warehouse and found inconsistencies, not enough to prosecute the original accident, but enough to justify inquiries into record handling and safety compliance. They were forwarding information to the State Safety Division and to OSHA for review of current practices. That same week, an investigator from the State Bar called. She did not tell me what would happen, only that they had opened a file and wanted more details about who instructed whom and when. It was not victory, it was paperwork, it was interviews, it was waiting, but it was also a crack in the wall, something official, something that did not depend on family agreement. The hardest part was Ethan. He finally came to my house on a Sunday evening when the sky was already dark. He did not bring his wife. He did not bring the kids. He walked in like a man going to court. He held up his phone. "People are asking questions at work," he said. "Someone called my supervisor. They know about the accident now. At least part of it." I felt my throat tighten. I did not take pleasure in that. I could not. He was my son. "I am sorry," I said. "Not for telling the truth. For the fact you are meeting it this late." Ethan's eyes were red not from tears, but from exhaustion. "You think this is justice," he said. I shook my head. "I think it is consequence. Justice would have been 15 years ago with a young man who still had a choice." He stared at me for a long moment. Then his shoulders sagged the way they had at the hospital back then, when Marcus first showed up. "I never stopped thinking about him," Ethan said quietly. "About the man who got hurt. About Marcus. I just got better at pushing it down." I nodded. So did I. He turned toward the door, then stopped with his hand on the knob. "If you find those records Marcus kept," he said, "tell me. I want to see what he wrote. I want to know what I refused to know." When he left, I stood alone in the entryway, the house quiet around me. The process I had started was moving slow and imperfect, like everything real. It would not bring Marcus back. It might not even bring punishment that looked satisfying from the outside. But it was unraveling the story my family had built. And somewhere out there, someone had emailed me a warning that I still had not traced, a reminder that the truth was not just buried. It was being guarded. The first warm Saturday after everything started moving again, I drove out alone to Maple Hollow Cemetery. The snow had finally retreated into the shady corners of town, leaving the ground soft and dark, the kind of earth that looks like it remembers. I parked by a line of bare oaks and walked with my hands in my coat pockets, following the small signs, until I found the newer section, where the headstones still looked clean, their edges sharp. Thomas Rourke, 55. That was the name on the stone. Not a grand marker. No marble angels. Just a flat gray slab with dates and a space that felt too empty for the trouble this man had carried. Someone had left a small flag in the ground, nearby the cheap kind you see around Memorial Day, the fabric faded at the folds. I did not know if he had served. Maybe someone else decided he deserved the gesture anyway. I stood there for a while before I spoke. It felt wrong to talk at first, like the cemetery itself demanded restraint. The wind moved through the branches overhead, and the sound was low, steady, like breath. "I did not come to apologize for what happened," I said quietly. "I came to tell you I finally stopped helping them pretend." The words sounded plain out there, stripped of drama. That was the truth of it. I had spent years thinking silence was the same thing as protection. I had convinced myself that keeping a family intact was the highest form of duty. But standing at that grave, I understood what duty becomes when it is built on a lie. It becomes a cage. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the watch. Not the one that had been on his wrist at the funeral. That one was gone, buried, or taken, I still did not know. This was the one I bought my son when he started his first job. I found it in a box at his place a week after our argument, tucked under an old pair of work gloves. He handed it to me without a speech, like he could not stand to keep wearing it. I held it in my palm and watched the light catch the scratched metal. It was a small object. It did not look like the kind of thing that could change a family. But I knew better now. Symbols are how men live with what they cannot say. Behind me, footsteps crunched slowly on gravel. I turned, expecting a groundskeeper, but it was my son. Luke stood a few yards away, hands shoved deep in his jacket. He looked older than he did a few months earlier. Not in the face, in the posture, like the part of him that still believed adults always had answers had finally worn off. He did not come closer right away. He just looked at the stone, then at the watch in my hand. "I figured you would be here," he said. I nodded. "I did not tell anyone." He gave a short, tired smile. "Mom did not ask where you went this morning." That landed harder than I expected. My wife had not moved out, not officially. But the house had become two separate lives under one roof, passing each other like strangers who once shared a map. Luke stepped closer and crouched, brushing a small bit of dead grass off the edge of the stone with his fingertips. The gesture was gentle. It did not match the way our family had spoken about Thomas for years. They called him a problem, Luke said, like he was something you throw away. I watched my son for a long moment, and I saw the man he was becoming, not because he wanted to, but because life had pushed him there. He was not asking me to fix it. He was asking me to stand with him while he carried it. "The state bar sent me a letter," I said. Luke looked up. "About the lawyers." I nodded. They found enough to sanction one of the attorneys involved. Not jail, not handcuffs, but a suspension, a formal finding, a record that does not disappear just because people want it to. Luke let out a breath he had been holding. "So it is real," he said. "It was always real," I said. "We just made it invisible." He sat back on his heels and stared at the ground. "My supervisor asked me to take a leave," he said. "Not fired. Just take some time, get your head right. The way people say it when they want you gone without saying it out loud." I felt something twist in my chest. I wanted to tell him it would be okay. I wanted to promise him a clean ending. But that would have been another lie just dressed up in comfort. "I am sorry," I said. Luke shook his head once. "Not for this." He swallowed and looked back at the stone. "I am sorry for him, for Thomas, for that man who got hurt, for all of it." I turned the watch over in my hand. The second hand still moved, steady, unimpressed by regret. "Your mom thinks you did this to punish her," Luke said quietly. I stared out at the cemetery, at the rows of stones stretching into the distance. "No one gets punished by the truth on purpose," I said. "The truth just does not care who it hits on the way out." Luke nodded, then hesitated. "The email you got," he said. "The warning." My grip tightened on the watch. I did not tell him about that before. I had kept it to myself, partly out of caution, partly out of shame that I still felt vulnerable in my own home. "I showed it to the prosecutor," I said. "They traced it to a burner account. Nothing solid. But they told me something. Whoever sent it knew details that were never public." Luke looked down again, eyes narrowing in thought. "So someone close," he said. I did not answer. I did not need to. We stood in silence for a while, two men looking at the grave of a third, trying to understand what it meant that the dead sometimes carry more truth than the living. Finally, Luke spoke again. "Dad," he said, "what happens now?" I looked at him. I could have given him the easy answer, the one that makes you feel brave for a moment and empty later. Instead, I told him the only thing that felt honest. "Now we live with it," I said, "and we do better." He nodded slowly, as if that was enough, because maybe it was. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper, a receipt. He set it on the stone, weighed it down with a pebble. "What is that?" I asked. Luke's mouth tightened. "The settlement number," he said. I found it in my old files. "The case reference. I want to remember the facts, not the excuses." He stood and brushed dirt from his knees. I watched him feeling something I had not felt in a long time. Not pride, exactly. More like respect, the kind you earn when you finally stop lying to yourself. When we walked back to the cars, Luke stopped and looked at me. "If you ever tell this story," he said, "tell it straight. Not to make us look good. Just straight." I nodded. "I will." That evening, back in my quiet house, I sat at the same desk where I had written my notes, and I opened a fresh document. I did not write names first. I wrote what it felt like to be a father who confused silence with love. I wrote what it felt like to choose comfort over courage, and then to finally choose courage when comfort was already gone. If you have made it this far with me, I would like to hear where you are listening from, and what part of this story hit closest to home. Leave a comment, and if stories like this matter to you, stay with me. There are more truths we do not say out loud, and I am learning late in life that speaking them is sometimes the only way forward.